Okay, fantastic. This is a chapter of a book manuscript I have under review called Energy Without Conscience, Oil, Climate Change, and Complicity. The oil, writes petrogeologist Rick Bass, always tries to climb higher than it is, moving like a miner through and between pinhead spots of porosity, trying to get up to the area of least pressure, back to the Earth's surface where it used to be. I'm going to take on that idea of inevitability in this presentation. It's what I would call a kind of barefoot animism among petroleum geologists, or a sort of Latour before Latour, practiced by these experts. I'm going to take it as a cultural artifact that is surprisingly robust, both inside and outside the energy sector. And this is a myth of inevitability that manages to overcome two obstacles which ought to be fairly obvious. The first is what I call the supply boundary. So obviously we know that oil is not being produced in the Earth's surface, in the Earth's crust, at a fast enough rate. It is slowly being converted from kerosene, and this you can imagine is happening. But effectively, in the human timescale, there's an absolute limit to supply. So that's the finite supply, or the supply boundary, the notion of peak oil, which eventually we will get to peak oil. The second is what I call a sink boundary, or an atmospheric boundary. And that has to do with climate change, and it has to do with how much the atmosphere can absorb in terms of burned petroleum and allow industrial and civilized life to continue. So this myth of inevitability has managed to overcome those two kinds of obstacles. And I'm going to explore this through some ethnography, through some history and ethnography in Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is the place where oil was first discovered and used commercially. This isn't well known, but in 1859 there was a well drilled there that outperformed the Drake well of Pennsylvania. And as a result of that success and all the downstream industries from oil and gas in Trinidad and Tobago, it has the fourth highest per capita carbon emissions. And as a result of being small island states, it's very vulnerable to climate change. So it's a kind of crucible where all of these upstream and downstream issues from petroleum production really come together. Now, part of the inevitability, the first part of my talk is going to have to do with graphic representation, and a way in which 19th century visual vernacular of oil suggested inevitable flows, and especially in the 20th century when combined with the visual vernacular for economics in minerals, again suggested a kind of inevitability. So, the big question I'm answering here is essentially why good people do bad things, because the ethnography has to do with petroleum geologists who were my ethnographic informants, and in some cases my friends, and their moral position in all this. So, making the y-axis here. Let's see. Bruce Braun, the geographer, has described a moment in 19th century empire where Britain claimed the underground as a mappable, exploitable frontier. And so in 1860, look at this part of the Caribbean, it fell under the British Empire, and in 1860, London sent the Geological Survey to Trinidad, and geologist George Wall and artist Jas Sawkins came out with a bunch of images. This is the most rudimentary, which is a sketch of a cliff face. You can see the human figure down there. Actually, I'll use this pointer thing in a minute. They also produced what's known as a traverse section, which is an actual place, and showing three strata there. And that was all pretty basic. Note the abstraction, though, the movement towards abstraction and the loss of a real scale between the first and the second image. By 1912, Trinidad was a place, a kind of founding, proving ground for British geologists, and they were making columnar sections like this one. This is a manjack area. Manjack is another kind of hydrocarbon. And what's clear here is the principle of superposition operating, so that And this is a basic principle of geology, that the higher layers are more recent, the lower layers are older, and that depth corresponds with antiquity. Okay, and in this sense, there isn't a vertical axis written here, but you can imagine a y-axis which represents both time and downward elevation. Okay, let me jump forward here in the interest of time to more or less contemporary representations. The 1950s was a kind of petroleum heyday for Britain, and all the major U.S. companies were there. And this is East Penal Field, oil field, represented by a Shell geologist, which violates the principle of superposition in the sense that you have this huge thing, Hughes nonconformity here of an overthrust, which is trapping oil. And so the wells come down there through this cap rock here into the oil-bearing sandstone there. Okay? So what the issue then was to chart this stuff as it actually existed, and then to abstract it. So you also get in the 50s and 60s this kind of diagram, which is a summarized topography of South Trinidad, with a y-axis that refers to geological eras going back to the later Miocene, and all of these layers here, which are partly geographical to the southwest, west central zone, going down through different sandstones, which are oil-bearing in the case of the black parts, right? So we have a kind of a very abstract means of representing geological strata with the principle of superposition showing oil inside the sand. I'm going to jump forward again to one of my informants, Dr. Krishna Prasad, who's an independent oil and gas finder, and the most successful one in Trinidad. And so he had put together in the 90s a volume called the Petroleum Encyclopedia of Trinidad and Tobago. And this is his representation of a particular area. What's interesting about this is this idea of maturation and migration. What happens to oil? Organic material, I mean, I don't need to probably go through the whole history of this, but organic material gets buried in sediments and then and it falls deep enough into what's known as an oil window, which is about 5,000 to 15,000 feet below the surface, and get through pressure and through actually radioactive discharge from deeper down, gets baked into petroleum, well, first into asphalt, then into petroleum, then into natural gas. In the process of this, pressure forces it up along faults until it reaches what's known as an impermeable layer, or a break, or something that actually covers the fault, and it gets trapped there. And notice the language being used, the idea that oil should migrate, as it matures, migrate upwards until it's trapped and has to be recovered through oil production. This is the kind of language that the oil sector has developed, which suggests that oil kind of naturally should come up and naturally belongs on the Earth's surface. So that Krishna Prasad's other diagram I want to show you refers to this kind of migration up to a seep. In this case, there is no cap rock. The oil comes directly to the surface. And it's easy to imagine this when you're in Trinidad because the island contains the world's largest seep, a place known as the Pitch Lake. It's sort of like, it looks like a big parking lot. And when I would talk to petroleum geologists, they would constantly refer to seeps and their belief that 95% of the oil ever converted to the Earth's surface from Carrigan had come up to the surface naturally through seeps. I don't know how they get this figure of 95%, but they all agreed on it. So that the anomalous situation would be in the slide I just showed you, and the one before that, where there's a cap preventing the oil from seeping out. What I find interesting is this use of the word maturation, which is up there on the top, and was mentioned in Krishna Prasad's previous slide. Maturation is, of course, a model of change which is teleological. It might be linked to an analogy to the human body, the human fetus or something. It again suggests a kind of inevitability, right? It's not change, but it's maturation and migration, such that oil comes naturally to the Earth's surface. So all that is, I think, fairly straightforward history of geological representations before and during the oil age. What I want to argue here is that those representations have linked up and ramified economic representations. So in 1972, various bodies, the American Petroleum Industry, the World Petroleum Congress, began thinking about how to represent oil supplies. And in 72, the director of the U.S. Geological Survey, Vincent McKelvey, proposed this classification of mineral reserves and resources. And I don't want to go deeply into this. Resources refer to oil that's there. It might not be discovered yet, but it's there. Reserves refer to oil that can be produced for a profit. And again, when I say produced, I actually mean extracted, but the word that they use is production. And part of the reason they don't use extraction is they say that that's what miners do, and that's a very unnatural thing. You have to add energy, you have to dig down, and all this, and you have to put men and machinery underground. Production involves drilling through the cap rock and having natural pressure push the oil up. So this is the kind of chart that was developed, and there is a y-axis which refers to the commercial quality. Higher up is more commercially viable, lower down is not commercially viable. Well, this chart matured itself over a few years. Getting into this, I won't explain that too much, and getting into what we see as the modern chart is a little bit complicated. So here is what people call the commerciality threshold, right? Everything above that line can be produced for profit under the existing regulations and prices and technology, right? Regulation, prices, and technology tell you where the commerciality threshold is going to be. This oil exists, is known to, some of it is known to exist. This oil we're not entirely sure of. Range of uncertainty refers to the volumes, right? So the proven volumes are known to exist with 95% certainty. This one might be 10% certainty, right? So what the y-axis then refers to is the degree of commerciality. It's not a y-axis of depth. It's a y-axis of accessibility under given prices, technology, and regulations. The interesting thing, I've looked a lot at this, and that has been put there, in fact, very deliberately to prevent what happens, which is confusing this with a stratigraphic diagram, right? And people might think, oh, well, the reserves are equal to contingent resources because each of these layers is equally thick. And so the Nazi scale is supposed to protect the producer, the disseminator of this chart from some sort of liability or responsibility for that kind of error. But that's the sort of error that people slip into. Right? Let's see. I want to talk about one thing that happens when oil moves from resources to reserves. That's called proving up. And the oil industry borrowed this language. In Oklahoma in the early days, borrowed this language from the kinds of contracts that, what is that called exactly? The settlers, I can't remember, the improvement settler contracts. The homesteaders. Homesteaders got this, this deal where they had to prove up land, which is to say they had to invest in it somehow, build something on it, cut trees, maybe plant something. Proving up in this case refers to developing better technology, or prices might rise, the per barrel price of oil might go up, or regulations might be eased such that you can reclassify contingent resources as reserves and move them up over that commerciality threshold, right? So the project maturity here, remember this is the maturity language, comes in because what you do in the course of a project of the exploration and exploitation of an oil field is to try to move oil up over that commerciality threshold, right? Now that doesn't need to happen inevitably, but the way these two charts work together is that they produce, and they are produced by, a mentality that suggests that we are inevitably going to prove oil up, right? So I want to explain how this happens through a quick ethnographic vignette here on performance. So this is about natural gas in Trinidad and Tobago. Trinidad and Tobago is way past their peak in oil, but they're more or less seem to be at their peak now in natural gas. So the audit of natural gas is a very important annual event, and a firm in Houston here, Klein McAfee, sends people down to audit all the well logs and everything, and tell the country how much natural gas it has. And so, I'm sorry, it's Ryder Scott, and the guy's name was Larry McAfee. So, Ryder Scott is a firm in Houston. So, Larry McAfee came in the middle of 2010 and did a presentation to ministers and the press and so on at the country's leading hotel, and started with this chart and explained it to the people who didn't know. It's got all the same things. It's got the project maturity here. It's got this same commerciality threshold, not named there. We left out not to scale. And he presented the data. And this is the situation of BCF. There are thousands of BCF, which means roughly 14 TCF, trillion cubic feet of gas remaining in the country, right? And now what worries one immediately is if you see that in 2009, they produced 1.4 TCF, and they have 14 left. So what people in the press immediately thought is, oh my God, we only have 10 years of this stuff left, right? And the press, of course, and Ryder Scott knew this, the press was going to immediately say, here we are at the supply boundary, what are we going to do? Okay, so what you do then, is what Larry McAfee does, is you say that that ratio of 10 is a unitless ratio. It's not 10 years of production left. It's a reserve to production ratio of 10. And the way to last longer than 10 years is to do this reserve replacement. Reserve replacement here. Which means that if you use up 1.4 TCF of reserves every year, you have got to prove up 1.4 TCF of resources every year. And that this is doable if you do the exploration activities and so on. Right? And Larry McAfee was quite certain that this was doable, and all it required was work on the government's part. So, immediately after his presentation, Carolyn C. Prasad, who was the Minister of Energy, got up and presented the same chart and said, we have been able to transfer exploration resources into the reserves category, and she promised to prove up supplies. Right? So I think what this chart is, and I'm going to have to skip over a bit here. How much time have I got left? Right, not a whole lot of time. So I'm going to skip over some of this. There's a much longer explanation of the whole thing, which is deeply technical. I want to tell you about how this is applied, this whole mentality and inevitability syndrome is applied to thinking about climate change. So Trinidad and Tobago have been aware for a few years of its contributions to climate change, and mostly as a problem of public relations. And they decided what they were going to do is create what Gavin Bridge calls a backstream. And a backstream returns carbon from production to the lithosphere, and in theory leaves you at that zero situation. right? This is what you see this with carbon sequestration proposed for coal plants and so on. So Trinidad has a plan to take the largest, it's methanol plant, it's fertilizer plant, and draw the CO2 from that back to the oil fields and inject it in oil fields. And Krishna Prasad, whom I've already told you about, presented this in early 2010 at the same hotel at an annual energy conference meeting. And his plan is going to be very profitable because you inject the CO2 into partly depleted oil fields and use it for what's called secondary recovery to get, or enhanced oil recovery, to get the remaining oil out. So immediately after his presentation, I asked, well, that's very interesting. Do you end up ahead or behind? And he said, oh, we made lots of money. I said, no, I mean, does the CO2 injected down have more carbon content than the oil coming up? Right? That seems to be the obvious question if you're worried about the climate benefit. How do you know about it? The short answer to that question is I have no clue. And he said to me, and in front of this whole crowd of investors at the hotel. So I looked about this, I talked to all the experts, and the first thing was that I found nobody seemed to know, and more interestingly, nobody seemed to care. So the answer to, I finally found the engineer who really could do, the answer is you end up way behind, because a gas is always going to be less dense than a liquid, even under pressure. There's no way that you're going to end up sequestering more CO2 than you release once the gas is, once the oil is combusted. So what was striking to me is that people didn't care. What Prasad said is that I am convinced that one way or another, the oil will be produced. There is a bulk of oil that the world will produce, and it will be produced regardless. So his point of inevitability is that that oil at the bottom of these wells in South Trinidad was going to be proved up, was going to become commercial by rising above the commerciality threshold, and that somebody was going to produce it, so it might as well be him. So let me end here with a bit of a description of Prasad. Yes, this was here he is. So here he is. He is what Dipesh Chakrabarty calls a geological agent, right? He's a complex one. He's a geological agent because he is actually wreaking change to the conditions of life on planet Earth through this activity of producing oil that he's very good at. And I put it to him, we spent a lot of time with him. He's a complex individual. He has started what he calls an eco-resort on Tobago, which is a hotel that's powered by solar and wind and so on, and you have to fly to get there, but still, it's an eco-resort, and it's not just window dressing, because he doesn't tell anybody really about it. So I put it to him that if this oil, if he was the one who was going to tip the world over, would he produce this oil? Would he just leave it there? And he told me, well, it's going to take the world a while to change, and meanwhile the train is going down the track. He constantly said he wasn't the responsible one. He didn't have the power. He was very modest and suggested that this was a teleology that he was watching, essentially. But at the end of the day, he said, if I was going to be responsible for tipping the whole world over, then I can't do it. And that's where I'm kind of going with this book, is to see what is the moment of conscience and how even in the heart, in the belly of the beast, which is in this city and in Port of Spain, where people are persuadable to be the better kind of geologist, the more responsible kind of geologist. So let me end a little bit past time with that. Thank you.